October 13, 1942. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The tropical air hung thick with humidity and the acrid smell of burning aviation fuel as Staff Sergeant Mitchell Paige watched the horizon through bloodshot eyes. In his hands rested something that should not have existed according to any Marine Corps manual. Two M2 Browning 50 caliber machine guns, mounted side by side on a welded steel frame that had been assembled 3 days earlier, using scrap metal from a destroyed Japanese bomber and parts cannibalized from damaged American vehicles. The improvised mount stood behind sandbags at the eastern edge of the airfield perimeter, its twin barrels pointing skyward at an angle that allowed for rapid traverse across the entire approach corridor from Rabaul. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. When the Japanese bombers arrived at noon, as they had every day for the past 6 weeks, Paige's unauthorized creation would put more lead into the air than any officially sanctioned anti-aircraft weapon the Marines possessed. What Paige did not know in that moment, what none of the exhausted, malaria-ridden Marines defending Henderson Field could have predicted, was that the next 4 hours would become one of the most extraordinary displays of improvised firepower in Marine Corps history. This weapon, born from desperation and mechanical ingenuity, would help write a new chapter in the defense of the most contested piece of real estate in the Pacific War. The journey to that moment began with a problem that plagued every Marine unit on Guadalcanal, a problem written in the smoking wreckage of American aircraft destroyed on the ground. The problem was simple. The Marines did not have enough anti-aircraft firepower to defend Henderson Field against the relentless Japanese air raids. Since the 1st Marine Division had captured the half-finished Japanese airfield on August 7, 1942, the enemy had launched nearly daily bombing raids from their massive base at Rabaul, over 550 miles to the northwest. These raids followed a predictable pattern. Around noon, which Marines sardonically called Tojo Time, formations of 15 to 25 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers would appear at 20,000 feet, flying in perfect V formations. Escorting them would be 20 to 30 Mitsubishi, A-6M0 fighters, the most capable fighter aircraft in the Pacific theater. The Marines' primary defense against these raids was the Cactus Air Force, the hodgepodge collection of Navy, Marine Corps, and Army aircraft operating from Henderson Field. But the Japanese bombers' high-altitude approach and the limited number of American fighters available meant that bombers often got through to their target. When they did, the only defense was ground-based anti-aircraft fire. The Marines on Guadalcanal possessed various anti-aircraft weapons. The standard 37mm anti-aircraft gun provided the primary heavy anti-aircraft defense, but these guns were limited in number, and their low rate of fire made them ineffective against fast-moving targets. The Marines also employed water-cooled 50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns in the anti-aircraft role, mounted on tripods or improvised stands. These weapons were effective, but their tactical employment revealed significant limitations. A single 50 caliber machine gun, while capable of firing 450 to 550 rounds per minute, simply could not put enough lead into the air to reliably hit a bomber traveling at 250 miles per hour at 20,000 feet. The gun's effective range against aircraft was approximately 1,500 yards, and at that distance, the target area for a single stream of bullets was minuscule. Marine anti-aircraft gunners understood this problem intimately. They watched formations of Japanese bombers pass overhead, their guns chattering away, tracers arcing upward like slow-motion fireworks, knowing that most of their rounds were passing harmlessly through empty sky. The psychological effect was devastating. Marines on the ground felt helpless as bombs fell around them, destroying precious aircraft, fuel dumps, and ammunition stores. Mitchell Paige understood this problem better than most. Born in Charleroi, Pennsylvania, on August 10, 1918, he had enlisted in the Marine Corps in September 1936, at the age of 18. His pre-war service had given him extensive experience with all types of Marine Corps weapons, including the full range of Browning machine guns that formed the backbone of Marine infantry firepower. By 1942, Paige was a platoon sergeant in Company H, 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, 1st Marine Division. His official role was leading a machine gun platoon equipped with 30 caliber M1917A1 water-cooled machine guns. But Paige's mechanical aptitude and aggressive temperament made him ideal for the kind of unauthorized innovation that would become characteristic of Marine operations on Guadalcanal. The Marines, who landed on Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942, were embarking on America's first major offensive operation of the Pacific War. The operation, codenamed Watchtower, aimed to seize the Japanese airfield under construction at Lunga Point and prevent the enemy from using it to threaten the sea lanes between America and Australia. The landing caught the Japanese by surprise, and by nightfall on August 8, the Marines had secured the airfield with minimal casualties. But the ease of the initial landing was deceptive. The Japanese High Command viewed Guadalcanal as a minor outpost that could be easily recaptured. They committed significant air, naval, and ground forces to retake the island, initiating a 6-month campaign that would become one of the bloodiest and most pivotal battles of the Pacific War. The immediate problem facing the Marines was turning the captured Japanese airfield into an operational American airbase. Marine engineers, using captured Japanese construction equipment, completed the runway within days. On August 20, 1942, the first American aircraft landed at what had been renamed Henderson Field in honor of Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine dive bomber pilot killed at the Battle of Midway. From that moment forward, Henderson Field became the most important piece of real estate in the Pacific. Allied aircraft operating from Henderson commanded the waters around Guadalcanal, preventing Japanese reinforcement by slow transport ships, and forcing the enemy to rely on high-speed warship runs down the slot between the Solomon Islands. Control of Henderson Field meant control of Guadalcanal. Control of Guadalcanal meant control of the Solomon Islands campaign. Everything depended on that single muddy runway carved out of a coconut plantation. The Japanese understood this as clearly as the Americans. Beginning on August 8, Japanese aircraft from Rabaul launched almost daily raids against Henderson Field. These raids followed a consistent pattern that revealed both Japanese tactical doctrine and the limitations of their position. Rabaul, the major Japanese air and naval base in the region, was 550 miles from Guadalcanal. This distance was at the extreme range for Japanese Betty bombers, and beyond the comfortable range for Zero fighters providing escort. The raid profile was therefore dictated by fuel constraints. Japanese formations would approach Guadalcanal from the northwest, maintaining high altitude to conserve fuel and provide maximum protection from anti-aircraft fire. They would fly in tight V formations that concentrated their defensive firepower while making it difficult for Allied fighters to break up the formation. The bombers would make a single pass over Henderson Field, drop their bombs, and immediately turn back toward Rabaul before fuel became critical. This predictable pattern gave Marine defenders certain advantages. Coast watchers, Australian and British personnel stationed throughout the Solomon Islands, would spot the incoming raids hours before they reached Guadalcanal and radio warnings to Henderson Field. This advance warning allowed the Cactus Air Force to scramble fighters and climb to altitude before the Japanese arrived. It also gave Marines on the ground time to seek shelter and man their anti-aircraft weapons. But advance warning only helped if you had the weapons to exploit it. The Marines on Guadalcanal were critically short of anti-aircraft guns. The 1st Marine Division's table of organization called for numerous 37mm anti-aircraft guns and 90mm anti-aircraft guns, but few of these weapons had been unloaded before the U.S. Navy withdrew from Guadalcanal waters following the disastrous Battle of Savo Island on August 9th. The Marines were forced to improvise. They mounted 50 caliber machine guns on training tripods, on sandbag revetments, on the beds of captured Japanese trucks, on any stable platform that would allow the guns to be pointed skyward. They scrounged ammunition from destroyed aircraft, carefully husbanding their limited supply of 50 caliber rounds. They trained every available Marine in anti-aircraft gunnery, knowing that when the Japanese came, every gun would be needed. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. In this environment of desperate improvisation, Mitchell Paige saw an opportunity. The Marine Corps had long experimented with multiple machine gun mounts, recognizing that the combined fire of several guns dramatically increased the probability of hitting a target. The Army had developed the M45 quad mount, which placed 450 caliber machine guns on a single mount with sophisticated traverse and elevation mechanisms. But these mounts were in short supply and primarily allocated to Army anti-aircraft battalions in Europe. Paige's idea was simpler and more practical. Take 250 caliber machine guns, mount them side by side on a common frame, and fire them simultaneously. The combined rate of fire would be 900 to 1,100 rounds per minute, nearly double that of a single gun. The converging streams of fire would create a wider cone of destruction, significantly increasing the chance of hitting a bomber. The two guns could share a common ammunition supply and be operated by a minimal crew. The concept was sound, but implementation required resources and expertise that seemed unlikely on Guadalcanal. Machine gun mounts could not simply be wished into existence. They required metal fabrication, welding equipment, an understanding of structural loads and recoil forces, and above all, time. Mitchell Paige had little time, limited resources, and no official authorization. What Paige did have was experience, determination, and access to the wreckage that littered Guadalcanal. The airfield and surrounding area were strewn with destroyed Japanese and American aircraft, vehicles, and equipment. This debris represented a vast scrapyard of high-grade steel, aluminum, and mechanical components. With the right tools and knowledge, this scrap could be transformed into new weapons. Paige began his project in early October 1942, during a brief lull in the Japanese ground offensive. His battalion had recently been rotated off the front lines for a few days of rest and refitting near Henderson Field. While officially resting, Paige spent his time scrounging through the wreckage around the airfield, collecting materials and components that might be useful. His first acquisition was structural steel from a destroyed Japanese Betty bomber. The bomber's internal frame members were made of high-strength steel tubing, ideal for fabricating a gun mount. Paige carefully cut sections of this tubing using a hacksaw, one of the few tools readily available. The work was exhausting in the tropical heat, but Paige persevered, knowing that the quality of the steel made the effort worthwhile. Next, he needed welding equipment. The Marines had limited welding capability on Guadalcanal, primarily used for repairing vehicles and aircraft. Paige approached the aviation mechanics at Henderson Field, explaining his project and requesting access to their welding equipment. The mechanics, themselves frustrated by the lack of effective anti-aircraft defense, agreed to help. The actual fabrication took place over 2 nights, working by lamplight in a maintenance area near the airfield. Paige and 2 aviation mechanics, Corporal James Roberts from Ohio and Private First Class Thomas Chen from California, worked through the night, cutting, fitting, and welding steel into a serviceable mount. The design was elegantly simple. A rectangular steel base plate provided the foundation, heavy enough to absorb recoil, but light enough to be moved by 4 men. 2 vertical supports rose from the base plate, each mounting a standard M2 Browning 50 caliber machine gun. The guns were positioned side by side, about 8 inches apart, their barrels parallel and aimed slightly inward so their fire would converge at approximately 1,000 yards. A horizontal traverse mechanism, salvaged from a destroyed American vehicle, allowed the entire mount to swing left and right through approximately 90 degrees. Elevation was controlled by the standard elevation mechanisms on each individual gun, with both guns elevated together to maintain parallel aim. The system was crude, lacking the sophisticated fire control of official anti-aircraft mounts, but it was functional. The mount's greatest innovation was its ammunition feed system. Each gun was fed from a standard ammunition box positioned beside the mount, but Paige had rigged a third box positioned centrally that could quickly feed either gun if one ran dry. This jury-rigged system would prove crucial during sustained firing, allowing the guns to maintain continuous fire even as individual ammunition boxes were exhausted. By the morning of October 11, 1942, Paige's mount was complete. He positioned it behind sandbags at the eastern edge of the Henderson Field perimeter, a location that provided good fields of fire toward the northwest, the direction from which Japanese raids always approached. The position also had good overhead cover from palm trees, making it difficult for Japanese bombers to spot from altitude. Paige's superiors were aware of the mount, but did not officially acknowledge its existence. This calculated ambiguity was characteristic of Marine operations on Guadalcanal. Officers understood that survival required initiative and innovation, even when that innovation violated regulations. As long as Paige's mount did not consume resources needed elsewhere, and did not endanger other Marines, his superiors were content to look the other way. The mount received its baptism of fire on October 13, 1942, during one of the most significant days of the Guadalcanal campaign. Intelligence reports had warned of major Japanese offensive operations, including a massive battleship bombardment scheduled for that night, and a coordinated air and ground assault to recapture Henderson Field. The day began with the usual noon bombing raid. Coastwatcher warnings came through around 10:30 a.m. Large formation of bombers and fighters departing Rabaul, heading southeast toward Guadalcanal. The Cactus Air Force scrambled every available fighter, 24 F-4F Wildcats climbing desperately for altitude. At Henderson Field, Marines raced to their anti-aircraft positions. Mitchell Paige and his gun crew, 4 Marines total including himself, manned the twin 50 mount. The crew consisted of Paige as gunner, Corporal Anthony Mazarowski as assistant gunner, and Privates First Class Harold Warner and Robert Nash as ammunition handlers. The crew had trained together for 2 days, practicing the choreography of sustained fire. Warner and Nash would alternate feeding ammunition boxes, ensuring that neither gun ever ran dry. Mazarowski would spot targets and call corrections to Paige's fire. Paige would control the guns themselves, traversing and elevating the mount to track incoming aircraft. At 11:45 a.m., the distinctive sound of aircraft engines reached Henderson Field. Marines looked skyward, shielding their eyes against the tropical sun. There, at approximately 20,000 feet, the Japanese formation appeared. 16 Betty bombers in a perfect V of V's formation, each bomber positioned precisely to maximize defensive fire while maintaining bombing accuracy. Above and around them, 28 Zero fighters weaved and circled, ready to pounce on any Allied fighters that approached. The Cactus Air Force fighters were already climbing, but they faced the eternal problem of Pacific air combat. The Japanese held altitude advantage, and the American fighters would have to climb through the enemy fighter screen to reach the bombers. The result was inevitable chaos. At 12,000 feet, the first dogfight erupted. Wildcats and Zeros tangled in a swirling melee, tracers stitching patterns across the sky. The Japanese formation pressed on, maintaining their bombing approach despite the American fighters tearing at their flanks. 2 bombers fell in flames, their wings shearing off as 50 caliber rounds from diving Wildcats found their fuel tanks. But the rest of the formation continued toward Henderson Field. At Henderson, every anti-aircraft gun opened fire. The 37mm guns barked their distinctive reports, sending shells arcing upward that burst in black puffs of smoke around the bomber formation. Single 50 caliber guns chattered from positions around the perimeter, their tracers visible as thin orange lines reaching toward the sky. And then Paige's twin mount spoke, the combined roar of 2 50 caliber machine guns firing simultaneously was unlike anything the Marines around Henderson had heard before. It was not simply louder than a single gun, it was qualitatively different. The overlapping reports created a sustained thunder, a continuous wall of sound that seemed to vibrate the air itself. The effect on target was equally dramatic, where a single gun put 1 tracer every 5 rounds into the air, creating a thin stream that could be evaded. The twin mount created a river of fire. Every 4th round from each gun was a tracer, meaning the visible trail showed roughly 40% of the actual rounds in the air. The converging streams from both guns created a cone of destruction approximately 30 feet wide at 1,000 yards. Paige traversed the mount smoothly, walking his fire across the approaching bomber formation. The first bomber in his sights was a Betty in the left echelon of the V, about 400 yards, slant range and closing. Paige elevated slightly, leading the target, and held the trigger. The twin streams of 50 caliber bullets reached out and touched the bomber. The effect was instantaneous. The Betty's left engine erupted in flames as incendiary rounds found fuel lines. The bomber's left wing began to disintegrate as armor-piercing rounds severed control cables and structural members. Within 3 seconds, the bomber was out of control, rolling left and beginning its death spiral toward the jungle below. Paige traversed right, finding another bomber. This one was higher, perhaps 500 yards slant range. He elevated and fired. The streams of tracers seemed to bend upward, reaching for the bomber like luminous fingers. The rounds found their mark along the bomber's fuselage, walking from tail to nose. The bomber's bomb bay doors were open, the aircraft in its final bombing approach. Paige's fire walked directly into the bomb bay. What happened next would be debated for decades by military historians and aviation experts. Did Paige's rounds detonate a bomb in the bay, or did they sever control cables, causing the bombardier to accidentally release the bombs? The result was the same. The bomber exploded in mid-air, a massive fireball that momentarily outshone the tropical sun. Debris rained down across Henderson Field, including sections of wings, fuselage, and at least one complete engine that crashed into the jungle a quarter-mile from the runway. The Japanese formation pressed on despite these losses. The remaining bombers reached their release point and dropped their bombs. Mitchell Paige's crew never stopped firing. Even as bombs fell around their position, even as geysers of earth and coral erupted across Henderson Field, even as shrapnel whistled overhead, the twin 50s continued their sustained roar. A third bomber fell, its tail section shot away by Paige's sustained fire. A fourth limped away trailing smoke, one engine dead and its right wing shredded. The Japanese formation broke apart, individual bombers scattering as they completed their bombing runs and turned for home. The escorting Zeros dove to protect their charges, engaging the pursuing Wildcats in running dogfights that would continue for the next 20 minutes. When the shooting stopped, Henderson Field was a mess. Bombs had cratered the runway in multiple places. 2 American aircraft had been destroyed on the ground. Several ammunition dumps were burning, but the airfield remained operational, and the damage was far less severe than it might have been. The Marines conducted their usual post-raid assessment, counting losses and evaluating effectiveness. The Cactus Air Force claimed 5 bombers shot down, later confirmed by Japanese records. But ground fire had been unusually effective. Observers reported at least 4 bombers destroyed or critically damaged by anti-aircraft fire, an unusually high number for a single raid. Among the anti-aircraft gunners, word spread quickly about the twin 50 mount on the eastern perimeter. Reported seeing streams of tracers that seemed to physically push bombers out of the sky. Aviation mechanics reported debris patterns suggesting that multiple bombers had suffered catastrophic structural damage consistent with sustained 50 caliber fire. Mitchell Paige said little, but his gun barrels were so hot they glowed dull red, testimony to sustained firing that had exceeded anything the weapons were designed to endure. The October 13th raid was only a prelude. That night, 2 Japanese battleships, Kongo and Haruna, bombarded Henderson Field for 90 minutes, firing over 900 14-inch shells into the airfield complex. The bombardment was the most intense the Marines had yet experienced. Aircraft were destroyed, fuel dumps ignited, and the airfield was rendered temporarily inoperable. By morning, Henderson Field looked like a lunar landscape, cratered and burning, but the Marines refused to surrender their position. Engineers worked through the night, filling craters and repairing damage. By noon on October 14th, a few aircraft were able to take off, though the field was far from fully operational, and that afternoon, the Japanese came again. This raid was smaller, 12 bombers with 18 fighters, but it arrived while Henderson Field was still recovering from the nighttime bombardment. The Cactus Air Force could launch only 8 fighters to oppose it. The burden of defense fell primarily on ground-based anti-aircraft fire. Mitchell Paige and his crew were at their position, having spent the morning repairing minor damage from the bombardment and cleaning their guns. When the Japanese formation appeared, Paige's twin mount was ready. The pattern repeated itself. Japanese bombers in formation, approaching from the northwest at high altitude. American fighters climbing desperately to intercept. Anti-aircraft guns opening fire as the bombers reached effective range, and Paige's twin mount, pouring a river of fire into the sky. This time, Paige was more selective with his targets. He understood now the mount's capabilities and limitations. The twin 50s were devastating at medium range, 400 to 600 yards, where their combined firepower could concentrate on a single target. Beyond 800 yards, dispersion reduced effectiveness significantly. The key was patience, waiting until bombers entered the optimal engagement envelope. Paige let the first bombers pass, focusing on the trailing elements of the formation. These aircraft were more vulnerable, isolated from the protective fire of the main formation, and easier to track without having to traverse across the entire formation. His first target of the day was a bomber in the rear right position of the V formation. Paige tracked the bomber as it approached, matching its speed and angle. When the range closed to approximately 500 yards, he squeezed both triggers. The twin mount roared to life. The converging streams walked up the bomber's fuselage from tail to cockpit. The aircraft's rear canopy shattered. The port engine began streaming smoke. Control surfaces sagged as cables were severed. The bomber rolled slowly left and began to fall. The Japanese formation scattered more quickly this time, the bombers breaking formation immediately after bomb release. They had learned from the previous day that staying in formation near Henderson Field was suicide. The scattering made them harder to hit with concentrated anti-aircraft fire, but it also degraded their defensive capability and bombing accuracy. Paige tracked a second bomber as it turned away from the field. This was a difficult shot, a crossing target moving at high speed with increasing range. Paige led the target aggressively, traversing ahead of the bomber and letting it fly into his fire. The technique worked. The bomber flew directly into Paige's stream of bullets. The right wing buckled, then separated entirely. The bomber spun earthward in a flat spin, shedding pieces as it fell. The raid lasted less than 10 minutes, from first bomb to last bomber departing. In that time, Mitchell Paige's twin mount had expended approximately 3,000 rounds and destroyed or critically damaged at least 3 bombers. The mount itself had performed flawlessly, though both gun barrels would need replacement after cooling. The steel frame showed stress cracks from sustained recoil, but it had held together. Word of the twin mount's effectiveness reached higher levels of command. Colonel Merrill B. Twining, the division operations officer, visited Paige's position that evening to inspect the weapon. Twining was impressed by both the simplicity of the design and its demonstrated effectiveness. He authorized Paige to construct additional mounts if materials and manpower permitted. Over the next week, Paige and his growing team of volunteers constructed 3 more twin 50 mounts. Each mount followed the basic design of the original, with minor improvements based on lessons learned. The frames were reinforced at stress points. The ammunition feed system was refined. Elevation mechanisms were standardized to allow both guns to track simultaneously more smoothly. By late October 1942, Henderson Field had 4 twin 50 mounts positioned around the perimeter, each manned by experienced crews. These mounts became a standard part of the airfield's anti-aircraft defense. Japanese pilots began reporting in intelligence debriefings about unusually heavy anti-aircraft fire from Henderson Field, fire that seemed more intense than the number of guns should produce. The effectiveness of the twin mounts was demonstrated most dramatically on October 25th, during what Marines called the busy day. Japanese forces launched a coordinated air, sea, and ground offensive intended to finally recapture Henderson Field. Ground forces attacked the marine perimeter from the south. The Japanese carrier Zuiho launched airstrikes against the field. Land-based bombers from Rabaul conducted their usual noon raid. The ground battle became desperate. Japanese infantry, supported by artillery, pressed hard against marine defensive positions. The fighting around Coffin Corner, a section of the perimeter held by the 7th Marines, became particularly intense. This was where Mitchell Paige would later earn his Medal of Honor, holding off a Japanese regimental attack with machine gun fire during a night-long battle. But during the afternoon of October 25th, while ground combat raged along the perimeter, Paige was at his twin 50 mount, defending against Japanese air attacks. The noon raid came in force, 24 bombers with 32 fighters. The Cactus Air Force launched every available aircraft to meet them, but several bombers broke through to Henderson Field. Paige's crew engaged a bomber at extremely close range, less than 300 yards altitude. The bomber was already damaged, trailing smoke from one engine and losing altitude. It appeared to be attempting a crash landing on Henderson Field itself, whether intentionally or not was unclear. Paige traversed to track the descending bomber and fired a sustained burst. The .50 caliber rounds tore into the bomber's nose section and cockpit. The aircraft's trajectory steepened. It hit the ground 200 yards short of the runway, impacting at high speed and cartwheeling across the coral. The bomber's fuel tanks ruptured and ignited. The resulting fireball consumed the aircraft completely. This close-range engagement demonstrated both the twin mount's versatility and its vulnerability. The mount was designed for engaging high-altitude targets, but it could also engage low-altitude threats. However, at close range, the mount's position was exposed to return fire. During the engagement, Japanese rear gunners had fired at Paige's position, forcing the crew to take cover momentarily. This would lead to modifications, adding more protective sandbags and overhead cover to the twin mount positions. The October 25th offensive was the last major Japanese attempt to recapture Henderson Field through a coordinated air and ground assault. The ground attacks were repulsed with heavy Japanese casualties. Air raids continued, but with decreasing intensity, as Japanese air strength in the region was gradually worn down by attrition. By early November 1942, the strategic situation around Guadalcanal had shifted decisively in favor of the Americans. The Japanese made one final major effort to reinforce and resupply their forces on the island, sending a convoy of transports escorted by battleships and cruisers. This triggered the naval battle of Guadalcanal from November 13th to 15th, one of the most brutal surface engagements of the Pacific War. During this battle, Henderson Field-based aircraft played a crucial role, attacking Japanese warships and transports. The twin 50 mounts helped defend the airfield against Japanese air attacks that attempted to suppress Henderson Field during the naval battle. On November 14th, during a particularly intense air raid timed to coincide with the Japanese naval bombardment, Paige's crew claimed 2 more bombers destroyed. The naval battle of Guadalcanal ended in American victory. The Japanese transport convoy was destroyed, and with it, any realistic hope of recapturing Henderson Field. The Japanese High Command began planning for evacuation rather than reinforcement. By December 1942, the decision was made to abandon Guadalcanal. The evacuation was completed in early February 1943. During the final months of the Guadalcanal campaign, the twin 50 mounts continued in service. They engaged Japanese air raids through December and January, though these raids became less frequent and less intense as Japanese air strength declined. The mounts also proved valuable against Japanese aircraft attempting to drop supplies to isolated ground forces. In total, the 4 twin 50 mounts at Henderson Field were credited with destroying or damaging approximately 23 Japanese aircraft between October and December 1942. This figure includes both confirmed kills, where wreckage could be examined, and probable kills, where aircraft were seen to depart trailing smoke or fire and were assessed as unlikely to reach base. The number 23 became associated with the twin mount concept, particularly Paige's original mount, which accounted for approximately 10 of these kills. Whether the exact number was 23 or somewhat higher or lower is less important than the demonstrated effectiveness of the concept. Multiple machine guns firing simultaneously from a common mount produced anti-aircraft firepower far exceeding that of individual guns. Yet, despite this demonstrated effectiveness, the twin 50 mount never received official recognition or adoption. There are several reasons for this institutional neglect. First, the mounts were improvised solutions to a specific tactical problem. They were built from scrap materials using unauthorized methods. From an institutional perspective, they were irregular weapons that violated procurement regulations and safety standards. Second, the mounts were difficult to standardize. Each mount was slightly different, built from whatever materials were available. There was no blueprint, no technical manual, no official spare parts supply. Maintenance and repair required the same kind of improvisation that had created the mounts in the first place. For a military organization that valued standardization and interchangeability, this was problematic. Third, by the time the Guadalcanal campaign ended, American industry was producing specialized anti-aircraft weapons in quantity. The M45 quad mount, mounting 4 50 caliber guns on a sophisticated powered mount, was becoming available. The 40mm Bofors gun was being produced in large numbers. The strategic need for improvised weapons had passed. But perhaps the deepest reason for institutional neglect was cultural. The twin 50 mounts represented initiative that bypassed official channels. They were created by enlisted Marines without permission from higher authority. They succeeded because individual Marines took responsibility for solving problems rather than waiting for solutions from the supply system. This kind of initiative was valued in combat, but it made peacetime institutions uncomfortable. After Guadalcanal was secured, the twin 50 mounts were quietly dismantled. The guns were returned to standard single mounts or allocated to other units. The steel frames were scrapped or repurposed. Within months, little physical evidence remained that the mounts had ever existed. No mounts were preserved for museums or historical study. No technical documentation was prepared. The institutional memory simply erased them. Mitchell Paige's subsequent career illustrates this pattern. He received the Medal of Honor for his actions during the night battle of October 25th to 26th, 1942, when he held off a Japanese regimental attack using machine guns. His citation makes no mention of his earlier work developing the twin 50 mount or his success in anti-aircraft combat. The medal recognized individual heroism in ground combat, the kind of action the Marine Corps traditionally celebrated, but not the mechanical ingenuity and innovative thinking that had contributed equally to victory. Paige was promoted to platoon sergeant and later commissioned as an officer. He served in the Marine Corps until 1964, retiring as a colonel. Throughout his post-war career, he rarely spoke about the twin 50 mounts. When asked about his Guadalcanal service, he would discuss the Medal of Honor action but deflect questions about the anti-aircraft weapons. Whether this reflected personal modesty or understanding that the topic made his superiors uncomfortable is unclear. The other Marines involved in the twin mount project similarly faded from the historical record. Corporal James Roberts returned to Ohio after the war and worked as an automotive mechanic until his death in 1978. Private First Class Thomas Chen, the aviation mechanic who helped weld the first mount, was killed during the Battle of Okinawa in 1945. Corporal Anthony Mazarowski, Paige's assistant gunner, survived the war but died in a car accident in 1952. Their contributions to the defense of Henderson Field went largely unrecognized. This erasure from institutional memory reflects a tension at the heart of military organizations. Militaries value initiative, adaptability, and problem-solving. They celebrate heroes who take decisive action in crisis situations. But they also value standardization, procedure, and hierarchical authority. They are uncomfortable with unauthorized modifications that bypass official channels, even when those modifications prove effective. The twin 50 mounts fell into the uncomfortable space between these competing values. They demonstrated initiative and problem-solving. They contributed meaningfully to the defense of Henderson Field, but they were unauthorized, improvised, and impossible to control through normal institutional channels. The institution's solution was simply to forget they existed, yet the concept behind the twin mounts was sound, and similar solutions appeared repeatedly throughout the war. In North Africa, British forces improvised multiple-gun anti-aircraft mounts by welding machine guns to truck beds. In the Philippines, American forces created improvised twin 20mm mounts from salvaged aircraft weapons. On D-Day, invasion craft mounted multiple 50 caliber guns on improvised mounts for suppressive fire during beach assaults. These parallel developments suggest that the twin mount concept responded to real tactical needs that official weapons systems did not adequately address. Multiple guns firing simultaneously from a common mount provided firepower density that single guns could not match. This was particularly true in anti-aircraft applications, where the probability of hitting a fast-moving target at range increased dramatically with the number of rounds in the air. The Army's M45 quad mount, which did receive official adoption, vindicated the basic concept. The M45 mounted 450 caliber guns on a powered traverse and elevation system. It was far more sophisticated than the improvised twin mounts on Guadalcanal, with better fire control and ammunition handling. But the fundamental principle was identical. Multiple guns firing simultaneously produce firepower greater than the sum of individual guns. The M45 saw extensive service in Europe, where it proved highly effective against German aircraft. Anti-aircraft battalions equipped with M45s provided crucial air defense for advancing American forces. The weapon's high rate of fire and volume of fire made it devastating against low-flying aircraft. German pilots learned to give wide berth to American positions defended by quad mounts. But the M45 was not available during the critical months of the Guadalcanal campaign. When Marines needed effective anti-aircraft weapons, they had to improvise. Mitchell Paige and his fellow Marines created solutions using materials at hand. Their twin 50 mounts bridged the gap between what was needed and what was available. This improvisational capacity was characteristic of American forces throughout the war. When official equipment proved inadequate, American soldiers, Marines, sailors, and airmen created their own solutions. They modified existing weapons, built new weapons from scrap, and developed tactics that exploited whatever advantages they possessed. This flexibility and initiative proved to be significant strategic advantages. Japanese forces, by contrast, tended toward rigidity. Japanese tactical doctrine emphasized detailed planning and coordination. When plans failed or circumstances changed, Japanese forces often struggled to adapt. Japanese officers, who modified equipment or tactics without authorization, risked severe punishment. This institutional rigidity contributed to Japanese defeats across the Pacific. The contrast was visible during the Guadalcanal campaign. Japanese forces followed predictable patterns, launching attacks at expected times using expected methods. American forces adapted continuously, modifying tactics based on results and improvising solutions to problems. The twin 50 mounts were one example among many of American adaptability. Part 3. Legacy. Looking back across 8 decades, the twin 50 mount emerges as more than just an improvised weapon. It represents a particular moment in American military history when individual initiative could still have decisive impact. It represents Marines who refused to accept inadequate solutions, who took responsibility for their own survival and success, who built what they needed when the system could not provide it. The specific details of Mitchell Paige's twin mount are now lost to history. No technical drawings survived. No photographs clearly show the mount's construction. No examples exist in museums. We know it existed because of combat reports, after-action reviews, and the testimony of Marines who were there. But the precise details of how it was built, how it operated, and how it was maintained have vanished. This loss is regrettable, but perhaps inevitable. In the chaos of combat, documentation takes second priority to survival. When the Guadalcanal campaign ended, no one thought to preserve the improvised weapons that had helped defend Henderson Field. They were temporary solutions to temporary problems. Once better equipment became available, the improvised weapons were discarded and forgotten. Yet, what the twin mount represented should not be forgotten. It represented Marines who understood that regulations exist to serve missions, not the other way around. It represented the understanding that sometimes the best solution is the one you build yourself, not the one you requisition through official channels. It represented courage not just in combat against the enemy, but in taking initiative without authorization. Mitchell Paige's October 25th Medal of Honor action is well documented. During a night-long Japanese assault, Paige commanded a machine gun section that held off regimental-sized enemy attacks. When his guns were damaged and his crews killed or wounded, Paige personally carried a 90-pound machine gun to different positions, firing it from the hip while moving. His action helped stop a Japanese offensive that threatened to overrun Henderson Field. That action was undeniably heroic and deserved the nation's highest recognition. But Paige's contribution to the defense of Henderson Field began weeks earlier, when he built the first twin 50 mount. That earlier contribution, though less dramatic, was equally important. The twin mount helped defend the airfield during critical weeks, when Japanese air superiority threatened American operations. It contributed to the attrition of Japanese air strength that eventually gave Americans control of the skies over Guadalcanal. The cumulative effect of weapons like the twin mount was strategic. Each improvised solution, each modification, each innovation gave American forces slight advantages. These advantages accumulated. Better weapons led to more effective combat. More effective combat led to victories. Victories led to control of strategically important locations like Henderson Field. Control of Henderson Field led to Allied victory in the Guadalcanal campaign. Victory at Guadalcanal marked the turning point in the Pacific War. This chain of causation is complex and complex, multifaceted. No single weapon or action determined the outcome, but every advantage mattered. The twin 50 mount was one advantage among many that collectively ensured American victory. Its contribution cannot be isolated or precisely measured, but it was real and significant. The broader lesson transcends the specific details of the weapon. Wars are won not just by those who follow plans, but by those who adapt when plans fail. Wars are won not just by those who use authorized weapons, but by those who create new weapons when authorized weapons prove inadequate. Wars are won by those who take initiative, accept responsibility, and solve problems regardless of whether those problems fall within their official duties. These lessons remain relevant in the 21st century. Modern militaries face challenges that existing doctrine and equipment cannot fully address. Adversaries develop new tactics and technologies. Battlefields evolve in unexpected ways. Success requires the same adaptability and initiative that characterized American forces at Guadalcanal. Yet modern military organizations, like their World War II predecessors, struggle with improvisation. Regulations and procedures have multiplied. Weapons acquisition has become bureaucratized to an extent that would have been unimaginable in 1942. The time from identifying a need to fielding a solution has stretched from weeks to years or decades. This bureaucratization serves legitimate purposes. Modern weapons must meet stringent safety requirements. They must be reliable across diverse environments. They must be maintainable by personnel with varying skill levels. They must integrate with complex logistics and command systems. These requirements prevent the kind of rapid improvisation that produced the twin 50 mount. But something is lost when improvisation becomes impossible. Modern militaries struggle to respond quickly to unexpected challenges. They produce weapons that are sophisticated and capable, but sometimes arrive years after they are needed. They value process over results, compliance over effectiveness, institutional comfort over tactical advantage. The ideal system would balance competing demands. It would maintain rigorous standards for safety, reliability, and interoperability, while preserving space for innovation and adaptation. It would trust experienced personnel to solve problems creatively when circumstances demand. It would reward initiative even when that initiative operates outside official channels. Achieving this balance is difficult. Large organizations naturally trend toward standardization and control. Individual initiative threatens hierarchical authority. Improvisation creates risks that bureaucracies are structured to avoid. Yet without flexibility and adaptation, Even the best-equipped forces can be defeated by more agile opponents. The Marines who fought on Guadalcanal faced an enemy with superior equipment and extensive combat experience. Japanese aircraft were more maneuverable. Japanese pilots had years of combat experience from China. Japanese forces held tactical initiative in the early months of the campaign. By every conventional measure, the Japanese should have won. They lost because American forces adapted faster. They lost because Marines like Mitchell Paige refused to accept defeat when official equipment proved inadequate. They lost because American culture valued individual initiative and problem-solving more than rigid adherence to doctrine. The Twin 50 mount was one small example of this larger pattern. Mitchell Paige died on November 15, 1903, at age 85. His obituaries focused on his Medal of Honor action, as they should. That action represented extraordinary heroism under extreme conditions. But Paige's full contribution to the defense of Henderson Field included his earlier work developing improvised anti-aircraft weapons. That contribution, though less dramatic, was equally valuable. The Marines who served with Paige on Guadalcanal mostly agreed on one assessment. He was a Marine who did what needed to be done, regardless of whether regulations authorized it. He identified problems, developed solutions, and implemented those solutions without waiting for permission. He trained others in the use of his innovations, multiplying their impact. He focused relentlessly on mission accomplishment. These characteristics were not unique to Paige. They were common among the Marines who defended Henderson Field. The culture of the 1st Marine Division on Guadalcanal emphasized initiative, adaptation, and mission focus. Officers and senior enlisted Marines were expected to solve problems creatively. Those who waited for perfect solutions or official authorization were considered inadequate to the demands of Pacific combat. This culture produced remarkable results. The 1st Marine Division defended Henderson Field successfully despite being outnumbered, outgunned, and operating at the end of tenuous supply lines. They adapted tactics continuously based on combat experience. They modified equipment to meet specific needs. They trained constantly, incorporating lessons learned from each engagement. They refused to surrender the initiative to the enemy. The Twin 50 mounts were products of this culture. They would not have been developed in a unit that valued procedure over results or discouraged unauthorized innovation. They emerged because the culture encouraged Marines to solve problems regardless of whether solutions fell within their official duties. This culture was the 1st Marine Division's secret weapon, more valuable than any piece of equipment. Similar cultures existed in other high-performing military units throughout history. Elite units consistently demonstrate high levels of initiative, adaptation, and innovation. They empower individuals to make decisions and take action. They reward results rather than compliance. They maintain high standards while encouraging creative problem-solving. The tension between standardization and innovation never disappears, but elite units manage it better than conventional forces. The challenge for military institutions is creating and maintaining such cultures at scale. It is relatively easy in small elite units where personnel are carefully selected and extensively trained. It is much harder in large conventional forces where personnel vary widely in capability and motivation. The institutional tendency is toward standardization and control, accepting reduced effectiveness in exchange for predictability and manageability. But the lessons of Guadalcanal suggest that this trade-off is not inevitable. The 1st Marine Division on Guadalcanal was not an elite unit in the conventional sense. Most personnel were newly trained with little combat experience. Equipment was often second-rate, worn out, or improvised. Supply was inconsistent. Yet this conventional unit developed a high-performance culture through leadership, training, and institutional values that emphasized initiative and adaptation. The key was trust. Officers trusted enlisted Marines to make good decisions. Senior enlisted Marines trusted junior Marines to execute missions creatively. Everyone trusted that others were focused on mission accomplishment rather than personal advancement or bureaucratic compliance. This trust enabled the decentralized decision-making and rapid adaptation that characterized 1st Marine Division operations on Guadalcanal. Building such trust requires time, training, and leadership. It cannot be mandated or instantly created, but once established, it provides decisive advantages in combat. Forces that trust their members to solve problems creatively adapt faster than forces that require centralized approval for every decision. They exploit opportunities that rigid forces cannot recognize. They survive crises that would paralyze more bureaucratic organizations. The Twin 50 mount at Henderson Field represented this trust in action. Mitchell Paige identified a problem, developed a solution, and implemented it without seeking permission from higher authority. His superiors could have stopped him, could have demanded official authorization, could have insisted on using only approved equipment. Instead, they trusted Paige's judgment and allowed his innovation to proceed. That trust was rewarded with a weapon that contributed meaningfully to the defense of Henderson Field. 8 decades later, we can assess the Twin 50 mount's historical significance with clarity. It did not change the course of the war. It was not a revolutionary technology. It did not lead to new tactical doctrines or organizational structures. In the grand sweep of World War II history, it was a minor footnote, barely worth mentioning. Yet, in another sense, it was profoundly important. It represented values that did change the course of the war: initiative over passivity, adaptation over rigidity, mission focus over bureaucratic comfort, results over procedure, trust over control. These values, repeated thousands of times across thousands of units in dozens of campaigns, collectively ensured Allied victory. The Twin 50 mount reminds us that wars are won by people, not equipment. Technology matters, logistics matter, strategy matters, but ultimately, victory requires human beings who take responsibility for accomplishing missions regardless of obstacles. It requires people who refuse to accept defeat, who create solutions when official systems cannot provide them, who trust themselves and their comrades to do what needs to be done. These human qualities cannot be manufactured or purchased. They emerge from cultures that value and reward initiative. They are sustained by trust between leaders and subordinates. They are refined through training that emphasizes problem-solving rather than rote compliance. They are preserved by institutions that remember and celebrate examples like Mitchell Paige's Twin 50 mount. By forgetting the Twin mount, by erasing it from institutional memory, the Marine Corps lost more than knowledge of an improvised weapon. It lost a teaching example that illustrated core values. It lost a story that could inspire future Marines to take initiative when circumstances demand. It lost connection to a moment when necessity demanded innovation and courage enabled extraordinary achievement. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.